Take a person, take a story, take you on a journey. It's your take.
Hello and welcome to Your Take. I'm your host, James Ewen. Thanks for watching and please subscribe to the channel. See all our interviews with people sharing their stories, their careers, talking about their life, all through their own perspective. On today's programme, I talked to a British record producer who has worked with some of pop's finest. My guest got his first taste of the music business when he had a chance meeting with Roxy Music's guitarist, Phil Manzanera. That chance meeting led him to help design and oversee the building of a state-of-the-art recording studio. My guest went on to work in the recording industry for many years, producing albums and recordings from all around the world: Paris, Basel, New York, St. Louis, Los Angeles, Sydney, Monsterrat and Barbados. My guest went on to work with one of the biggest bands of the 1980s, Duran Duran. He produced the 1983 studio album, Seven and the Rag Tiger, the UK #1 hit single, Is There Something I Should Know, and Live at Hammersmith 82. My guest was a production assistant on the Avalon album by Roxy Music, produced Pulling Rabbits from a Hat for Sparks, and has worked with the bands New Asia, Belouis Some and OMD. Today's Your Take guest is Ian Little, who recently released the book Baptism of Fire and features on the documentary Under the Volcano about Air Studios. We talk about Ian's early life, a chance meeting which led to his break in the recording industry, the highs and lows in his life, writing his recent book, and what the future might hold. A very warm welcome on this Monday evening.
Thank you.
Thank you kindly.
Thanks for the opportunity. Very welcome.
I'm very much looking forward to talking about your career in the music business, but finding out basically how it all happened from the very beginning and some of the names we've already mentioned in the introduction.
Yeah, few inaccuracies, I've got to say, but I'll tell you about those in a minute, and it's understandable because my career has been pretty hectic.
Sure.
And my life, I mean, if we go back to the beginning, my life has been, I suppose, bathed in luck, serendipity. I was abandoned this is what my mum told me. I was adopted as a 6-month-old baby. My mum that adopted me was a wonderful woman, and her husband, Harry, Ros and Harry, said that I was abandoned in a phone box. Do you remember the old red phone boxes?
I do indeed, yeah.
Well, apparently I was found all wrapped up in a bag in a phone box near Lambeth. And somebody found me in there and took me to Lambeth Hospital. And from there, I was taken to a children's home in Kent. It's called the National Children's Home. The biggest was Barnardo's. National Children's Home was the smaller one. And my mum had a child of her own 9 years earlier. But the sort of woman she was, when her and her husband could afford to have a second child, she felt, because after the war, there were a lot of orphans, and she felt that it was a better thing to do to adopt a baby than to have another one of her own. And so they went to the National Children's Home, and she just said, we walked along this row of cots with babies, and there was me going, yay! So she picked me, and I couldn't have been brought up in a more loving, just fantastic upbringing. I mean, I was given the freedom to do and be what I wanted to be, and allowed to go. I was the first person in my family, but I went to university to do fine art painting. Well, not every parent would support that, because it's not really a guarantee of a good job. You know, you want to go and do accountancy or business management. My mum said, that's what you want to do, then that's what you got to do. So I went to Kingston Polytechnic, as you said in your notes to me, and I studied fine art painting and failed deliberately. But there was a load of us. You know, the way the BA works is you do a year foundation.
Yeah, sure.
Do a little bit of everything, and then you decide what you want to focus on for your BA. And at that time, minimalism and conceptualism were the main movements in fine art. So Carl Andre had just sold his bricks to the Tate. Do you remember that? It was in the Sun. They worked out how much these bricks would cost if you went to a builder's merchant. It's just like a arrangement of one row of bricks, sort of 10 wide and 20 long. The Tate paid 40,000 quid for it. And of course, the Sun got hold of the story and said, well, a brick at a builder's merchant would cost you 54p. So they've paid about £34,000 more, whatever, you know, they made a big deal out of it. But anyway, the reason I mention all that is because as young people going into a BA course, a lot of us moved en masse from the foundation course into Kingston BA. We did our foundation at Kingston and then went to do our BA at Kingston. And we just went to the head of the department and said, right, we don't want any curriculum. We don't want to do life drawing. We don't want to do any of this rubbish. We know exactly what we want to do. So that's it. And because there was such a body of us, he had no choice but to let us. So we just did what we wanted. And I realized very early on that I was rubbish, that there were other people in my year that were far better than me. And so a few of us set out to deliberately get a fail in the last year by not presenting any work for our final show. And so I've got a BA failed. And it's something I'm quite proud of.
I wanted to backtrack a little bit, because you've given us this background about being abandoned as a small child. But I kind of wanted to delve a little bit and speak about your foster parents. And can you kind of just paint a bit of a portrait on them, who they are, what they did for a living? And you mentioned that they were very supportive and, you know, they were very loving towards you. And did you ever kind of reconnect with your real parents and your sibling?
The reason I don't know that story about me being found in a phone box. I don't really know whether that's true or not, because my mum told me I was adopted when I was about 8 or 9 years old, because my adopted father died when I was 11, very sadly. Now, he had been a Royal Navy man and then had a reasonable job. He worked for an insurance company. He'd been in some sort of engineer in the Navy. And so he used to go around looking at industrial plant and making sure it was being properly maintained, so that if the company put in an insurance claim, then, you know, my dad would say, yeah, that they were looking after the machinery, it's properly maintained, so this is a genuine claim. Or he would say, no, they were cutting corners, they weren't maintaining, and so we won't pay it. So that was his job. But as I say, he got ill very, very young. I mean, he died when he was 42 and I was 11. But my mum was just, it's hard to describe. I mean, I loved her so much. She had a stroke when she was 60 and died when she was 80 in 2002. She was a Christian. She was a Methodist, so it wasn't high church. You know, she didn't go to, you know, where they sort of swing incense around and wear silly hats. It was, you know, normal garb. And I mean, I'll tell you one thing about her, all right? I could go on forever about my mum. There was a mental hospital near where we lived, because I lived right on the edge of the Green Belt. You know, if I walked a mile I was in the countryside from my house, and there was this huge, great building that was a mental hospital. And my dad used to play cricket for the staff team there. And so we would go and watch the games on a Sunday. And my mum became friendly with some of the mental patients. And there was one guy in particular, and I mean, he looked mad. I mean, he couldn't shave himself, he couldn't dress himself, he was a nutter. But my mum invited him to come and stay at our house for weekends. And the curtain twitching that went on from the neighbours when they saw this guy arriving at our house. I said, Mum, everyone's looking. They can look as much as they want, Ian. He's a human being, the same as you and I, and he deserves a lot of love. And so I grew up. And another, just quickly, at my secondary school, which was at the edge of Surrey, there was one black kid in the school. And you know, like after school, when you're sort of 10, 11, 12, you go back to each other's, your mate's house for tea.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
This kid, I still remember, his name was Billy Daniels. And I said to my mum, can Billy come back to dinner, to tea? And she said, yeah, of course he can. The same thing. My mum did, so this was so ahead of her time. To have that open-minded attitude, and it instilled it in me. I've just always seen everybody as equal, and it came from my mum. And she wasn't an educated person at all. Her parents were in service. Her father was head gardener, and her mother was head housekeeper at one of the big brewery families. So, you know, she came from really humble beginnings, but had this incredible attitude of freedom and love and warmth towards humanity. And it just rubbed off on me. And as I say, she gave me the opportunity to do what I wanted to do.
You've given us a really interesting portrait of your background, but also this kind of loving memories of your mother, that she had no prejudice and was a very positive minded person that obviously rubbed off on you, you know, your way in life, and obviously gave you that drive to kind of go ahead and pursue a creative career.
Yeah.
You've spoken a little bit about your time at Kingston upon Thames Polytechnic doing the Art Foundation course.
Yeah.
And failing that, I kind of wanted to kind of skip forward a little bit and talk about your time after college, when you and your girlfriend at the time saved enough money to travel to India and Perth in Australia.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask what period this was and how long were you there for, and what was the experience like, experiencing another culture at a young age?
It was, I came in at the end of the hippie era. So I was an out and out hippie. I was into drugs. I was into the hippie culture. I started smoking hash when I was 14. I was taking LSD when I was still at school. I mean, I was just like so into the whole psychedelic counterculture. And so the trek to India was like a pilgrimage for hippies. And so we went, we didn't go overland. We flew on a one-way ticket from London to Delhi. And we had 600 quid each. We went up into Nepal, which is just like going back in time. I mean, the old part of Kabul, and this was in the mid-70s. So it hadn't been touristised. Is that a word? It hadn't been corrupted by tourism.
Kind of commercialised. And
But
I suspect back in those days as well, the world felt such a bigger place because there wasn't the technology and able to contact home and relatives and friends.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You hadn't got any internet or mobile phones or anything like that. So I can remember culture shock is something of a term that's bandied around too lightly, as far as I'm concerned. Real culture shock, the experiences you have when you experience real culture shock, they're etched into your memory. Like, I can remember us landing at Delhi. When you walk up the aisle to go out of a plane, have you ever flown to somewhere really hot?
The only place I've ever been really hot is Cairo, which is obviously.
Oh, well, so did you get the experience of, as you got closer and closer to the door, you felt like you were walking into a hot fan heater?
Yeah, I know what you're saying. Yeah, completely.
Right?
Yeah,
And that was and then because we had so little money and we wanted it to last as long as possible, we weren't going to get a cab into town. We were going to get the local bus. So the first memory that really etched itself like a laser etched into my memory was finding this local bus, had no glass in the windows, was painted top to bottom with like all Hindu deities and things, jingly bells and all sorts of adornments around it, and was being driven by a kid that looked like he was about 12 that had a loincloth on. And this, and I'm sort of thinking, what the, this kid's gonna drive us into Delhi. And then as we were driving into Delhi, I started noticing there were all these people sitting around open fires on the pavement. And this was normal. So, they're just too excited. That was in the first hour or two of arriving in India. And it just went on and on. We went to Goa to see Agra to see the Taj Mahal, and then we went up into Nepal, and we just fell in love with Nepal, and we stayed there for several months. And then we went to Bangladesh, from Bangladesh to Thailand, a little bit of time in Bangkok, and then went overland down the peninsula of Thailand, and then went across to an island called Koh Samui, which is now a very popular tourist place. But then there were no airport. Now there's 2 airports. The only way you could get to Koh Samui in that time was on the local ferry, and 2 or 3 sank every year just by being overloaded with people and goats and chickens and anything else they want. So it was like really taking your life into your hands. And we did that. And then we went from there to Perth, and we got working holiday visas for 6 months, which we got in London, and they were valid for something like 18 months. So we just about snuck in. And we were you had to get the working visa, you had to show that you had 150 quid for every month you wanted to stay there. So my girlfriend and I moved all our money into her account. She got a statement, then moved it all into my account. I got a statement, so that we could go to the Australian Embassy in the Strand in London and show that we both had, I don't know, 1,200 quid or something, which was more than enough money. And when we arrived or were flying into Perth, we were so petrified that they were going to see evidence of our money. And we had $50 between us. And fortunately, they were more interested in the fact that we might be smuggling food or, something like that. They're more concerned about importing diseases or bugs that might destroy the agriculture and stuff. So they searched our luggage thoroughly, but they never asked about the money at all. And so once we were through, yes, we're in.
Relief. Interestingly, How did you find that culture shift? Because you're in a country that's probably predominantly non-English speaking. There's, I'd imagine, a huge class divide from what I've heard from people that have been to India, and several different religious beliefs and different kind of ways and traditions of life. And then you go to somewhere that's a completely different culture,
Yeah.
a completely different time zone for starters,
Yeah.
but I'd imagine quite similar to the UK in many ways, Australia.
Australia was, it's just much better weather. And Perth, this is a little factoid. Perth is the most isolated major city in the world. It's something like 2,000 miles to the next major town. So it's incredibly isolated, and it's like a town in miniature. There were 3 parallel streets that were like the Oxford Street. There was 3 of them, and that was it. And then the rest of it was suburbs. Just a beautiful place. I mean, it was on the coast. It had a lovely bay, had a great park called Kings Park. So it was a fantastic place. I mean, the Australians were, you know, I used to say the only thing wrong with Australia was the Australians, but they weren't that bad. They were a bit, in those days, they were a bit, okay, mate, you want another tinny? You know, it was really a bit rough. They'd have steak and beer for breakfast. That was their sort of culture. So, but we just were there to work, because, you know, it didn't work out that way, but we wanted to. We'd met a German couple in Nepal who were buying genuinely old Tibetan jewelry, the silver and opal, and they were taking it back to Germany and selling it for 10 times what they were paying for it. And they gave us their contacts. And so that what we wanted to do was because they were living in India like kings, and they were doing 2-3 trips a year, you know, just back to Germany with like a few $100s worth of jewelry, and they'd come back with $5,000, enough to live for another 4 or 5 months. And so we wanted to do the same thing, but long story that I'm not going to go into, we ended up going straight back to London instead, to help a dear friend, but it didn't work out.
From your return to London, that kind of leads on nicely to my next question, and kind of the next phase or chapter in your life, if you want to call it. And basically, on your return to the UK, to London, you worked for a couple of young architects at Kingston. You set up their own small practice. Can you tell us what sort of work you were doing for them, and how did this chance meeting come about with Roxy music guitarist Phil Manzanera? How did that all happen?
You have to take a few steps back. When I was at Kingston, one of the first things that I learned was that if you want to get on in life, you have to get people to like you, and you have to get people that are influencers, as they call them today. And one of the 2 architects, a guy named Paul, very wealthy, his wife was very wealthy, and they were buying their own home right near the college, and they needed to rent out. It was a 2-bedroom terrace, you know, 2 up, 2 down. And I got invited round there, and I just walked into this place, and Paul, the architect, had completely renovated it. And I just started to go sort of snap, 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 looking at all the things that he'd done, and then started to tell him, not in a cynical way, but genuinely saying, wow, I love the way you've done that. I love the way you've done that. That looks amazing. Wow, what made you? And he obviously picked up on the fact that, you know, most people don't go in there and notice those things. And about 3 days after that, he came up to me at Kingston and said, would you like to rent the spare bedroom? I said, yeah, because, you know, I was just living in digs at the time. And that's how I became friends with him. So I left uni, went off around India, came back, and then found out that Paul and another architectural student, Alan, had set up, as you say, their own small practice. And I went to them, and to answer your question of what sort of work I was doing, I wasn't a trained architect, and most of the work they were getting, because let me explain. If you go into architecture, normally you would have to work for one of the big established practices for 10, maybe 15 years before you'd even think about going out on your own. But these guys, because of their wealthy connections, got work, not ground up builds, but things like renovations of mansion flats, where a renovation didn't mean a lick of paint, it needed architectural work. And so that was the first type of work that they were getting. And what I was doing renditions of different colorways, different schemes, you know, different arrangements. And that was, you know, my role was to just do these. And they were paying me sod all money, but I was happy, you know, I had something to do. And, you know, it was good fun. I was working in a creative industry. And then what happened was, to get to Manzanera, was Paul, the architect, and Phil Manzanera had both been to Dulwich College, which is a private public school in South London. And they met at a wedding. They hadn't seen each other for probably 10, 15 years, because Phil had gone off and become a rock star, and Paul had gone off and become an architect. And when they met, Phil Manzanera said to Paul, I bought this estate in Surrey, and there's an Art Deco house, and in the grounds there's an 18th century coach house, and I'm having a studio built inside it. Now, you know what listed buildings are? They can't be, if a building is listed, it can't be changed. Its appearance on the external appearance can't be altered. And so what he was doing was having the external shell of the building renovated, and then he was going to build a building inside of that, which would be a high-tech studio. And he basically said to Paul, I don't think the guy that I've got to do it is doing a very good job. Would you mind coming down and having a look at it? And so Paul, one day, he came back after this meeting with Phil, told Alan, the other architect, and Alan was too busy. So Paul said to me, well, why don't you come down there with me, and we'll have a look together. And so and Roxy Music were my band. So this was like, you know,
heaven.
Unbelievable, just unbelievable to have the opportunity to meet Phil. And the bottom line was that we got the contract off this guy because he was complete tosser. I mean, the design he came up with was useless. He'd had scaffolding around the building for 6 months, which was costing Phil a fortune. No roof on the thing, you know, it's a complete mess. So we took it over, we redesigned it. I mean, my part was very small. I mean, I was just, you know, T-boy really in the architectural practice with that sort of level of work. But I put my 2 pennyworth in. And then when it was finished, you know what studios in those days, they looked like the Starship Enterprise. You've got this huge, great desk, these massive, great speakers up, you know. And I just stood there and thought, man, this is me. This is what I want to do. Because I was still smoking dope every day. And I knew, because that's how I listened to music. I'd get stoned and close my eyes and just listen to it really intently. So I said to Paul, could you ask Phil if I could have 10 minutes of his time to get a few tips on how I could get into the recording industry? Well, because Roxy were my band, not 10 minutes, he sat there and listened to me rabbit on for 3 hours, because I knew all their solo albums, and he, at the end of the 3 hours, he said, you are hearing music as we hear it. Most members of the public, most punters, hear the finished product. You're hearing the component parts, you're hearing the layering. Sure, and so from that perspective, then I think you could have a career in this industry, right? Now, this is where, again, luck, just pure luck. I mean, how likely is that? that, you know, not only do we go to look at a studio, but it's the studio that's owned by the guitarist in my favorite band ever, right? So that's the first bit of luck. Second bit of luck, Phil, 3-4 days, well, the studio had got a real state-of-the-art alarm system, which had motion detection.
Right. Yes.
And it was on the top of a hill. Every time there was a strong wind, it would set the fucking thing off. Excuse my language. And it had this really antiquated system. You remember dial-up telephones?
A little bit before my time, but yeah, okay. Yeah, I do. Yeah, I remember them fondly. Yeah.
Well, this thing, it had a mechanical finger that was programmed to dial the number
of
the local police station. So if the alarm went off,
it would automatically
had to rush across from the house, get in and take the phone off the hook before it finished dialing, or else the police had come up and it would be a false alarm. And of course, there were a couple where he didn't get there in time, and they were all very nice because it was Roxy music and Phil. But obviously, he didn't want to push his luck. So he, about 3 days after we'd had this meeting and I'd sort of just blurted out my knowledge of Roxy, he rang up the architect's office and said, "Can I speak to Ian?" And it put me on. He said, "Ian," he said, "I want you to come down here. I've got a proposition for you." So I went down there and he said, "Listen, Roxy are going off on tour for 3 months. I don't want my wife left here having to deal with the alarm going off." Now, we built the studio with an office, a kitchen, and a shower room. So he said, if you want to move in and live in the studio so that we don't have to set the alarm, because they had to set it if it was empty because the insurance would be void. But if there was someone in it, you didn't have to set the alarm. So he said, if you're prepared to come and live in the studio, if by the time I get back, you've got an idea of how this all works, we'll talk again. In the time that he was away, what I realized was that the people, the companies that had installed the equipment, it would have been a prestigious gig for them to install a desk for Roxy Music Studio. So I used to ring them up and say, "Listen, you better get down here because this desk ain't working." And the bloke would come rushing down from the company and he'd look at the desk and he'd look at me and he'd push one button and everything, oh, there you go. Okay. So he sussed me out really quick. And he said, "You don't know what you're doing, do you?" I said, "Not a clue, mate." And so because it was such a lovely studio, he used to come after work and teach me how to.
Oh, wow.
And within 2 months, I'm not a musician, I can't play a thing, but I'd heard an interview with Brian Eno where the interviewer said to him, "What is your instrument?" You know Brian Eno, right?
Yeah, of course I do, yeah.
He said to Eno, "What is your instrument? What instrument do you play?" And Eno's answer was, "The studio." That was my inspiration. Because if you can't play a chord on a guitar because it takes 3 fingers, but if you play one note, put that on one track, then play the second note, put that on you can build a chord up and then you can just bar slide it up and down. So anyway, drum machine, bass, whatever, I made this ridiculous track and I went up to Beggar's Banquet. And in those days, Beggar's Banquet had a shop in Earl's Court and their offices were above. And if you went in and you ducked under the flap in the counter and went straight up the stairs, you were in the office. And the staff in the record shop thought if you did that, they just assumed you were meant to be doing it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I just went up there ducked under, went upstairs and sort of stood around looking, everybody's busy. And I said, excuse me, I've got my single. I want someone, can someone listen to it? And they just, Beggars Banquet had started 2 offshoots. One was called 4AD, which is still going to the day, signed the Pixies, Dead Can Dance, great label. They started a second one called Situation 2, which is defunct now. And the guy that ran it was a guy called Peter Kent. And he turned around and said, oh, I'll listen to it. So I took it over to him and he played it. He said, yeah, I'll put that out. That's cool. Yeah, okay. Gave me 1,200 quid, signed a contract on the spot. And he said, well, we'll do a picture sleeve. We might as well do it properly. This is my second release. So it's 002, SIT 002. It was called The Central Proposition. So he sent me, from there, he sent me to his designer. And he sort of gave me a few ideas. I said, yeah, whatever, you know, that sounds cool. Designed the cover. So, move forward a month or so, Phil's come back and he had a habit, I've later found out, of coming over to the studio, forgetting his keys. So he'd have to knock on the door to get into his own studio. So the day came, he came round, knocked on the door. I opened the door and just thrust my hand out with this 7-inch picture sleeve and said, he said, what's that? I said, that's my first single. He said, what? I said, it's my first single. I said, don't be stupid. Who did it? I said, I did it. Yeah, but who played it? I said, I did it. He couldn't believe it. So basically, I got a job in the studio as the gopher because of that. It's remarkable. My whole career in music, right? So I went from a standing start to having my first single out in 2 months. I then got a deal to do an album. I then worked as a production assistant on Avalon. That was, you said I produced Avalon. I didn't. Rhett Davies produced it. Brian Ferry, I was a T-boy, but Brian Ferry took a shine to me. And he used to, basically, he was a very private person. And it used to be when he was working, there'd just be him and Rhett Davies. And he started to invite me to stick around because I'd make coffee, take it in there, and I'd go to leave and said, Brian, I said, no, sit down. What do you think of this? And he started, because he'd been in my room and I was buying every vinyl that came out. One of the deals I had with Phil, he was paying me, I think, 50 quid a week. There was always food. I had somewhere to live. But the other option I said, the only other thing I said I wanted was an account at the local record shop in Chertsey. So every week I'd get all the music press, I'd go through, read all the reviews, and anything that I thought sounded interesting, I'd write down, and then I'd ring the record shop and say, right, I want you to get this, 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 and this. So one day I found Brian Ferry sitting in my room, flicking through all these albums. And he said, oh, I hope you don't mind. I said, no, fill your boots, you know, and whatever. He said, what's this like? I said, well, that's really good, actually. That track's really, you know. But I said, after about 3 or 4 albums, I said, listen, why don't I make you a cassette with what I think are the best tracks of 6, 7 albums? And he said, yeah, okay, that'd be really nice of you, thanks. And it became a ritual. Every week I'd make him a new cassette. And so, because I'm younger than him, about 10 years maybe. And so he saw me as being a bridge between the youth.
The new and the old, I guess, yeah. And
exactly.
And bringing in new influences. And,
exactly. And then what he did was, as I say, he started to invite me. I remember the day, probably the best egotistical day ever. I'm sitting in there with Brian and Rhett, and some musician comes in and says, oh, Ian, can you go down to Sainsbury's and get us a sandwich? And Brian just looked at him and said, get someone else.
What was it like working creatively with kind of a band that you idolized in Roxy Music? And can you describe about the creative process involved in sort of producing and getting the album
cut out-
Avalon made. And
You cut out. I missed the beginning of the question.
yeah, I wanted to ask you what it was like to work creatively with Roxy Music, and can you just describe the creative process and the experience of working on that Avalon album? And when you listen to it back now, 40 years later, what is your kind of, how do you kind of look back at that period, and what's kind of your opinion on the finished album?
Well, I'll start at the end of your question. The finished album is a classic. It's timeless. It sounds as good today as when it was made. I heard it about a month ago, and it just sounds brilliant. And the reason it sounds brilliant is because Brian Ferry was a fantastic curator of. So let me explain. He had Phil and Andy from the original band, Phil Manzanera, guitarist, Andy McKay, saxophonist. But Brian was really the boss. It was he wrote, out of 10 songs, he'd write 8. He'd give them 1 each, and he'd write the lyrics for those anyway. So he basically had all the publishing, which was part of his mindset. But what he also did was he got other musicians to come in and play, like Neil Hubbard, who was a really good guitarist, rhythm and pick, just brilliant. I can't remember who else. He was a great bass player, but he got these different musicians in, and say like with Neil Hubbard, he'd get him to play through a track maybe 6 times, just ad-libbing. And so, okay, fine, thanks, Neil. We'll and then Rhett, he and I would go through those takes, pick out phrases that we liked or he liked, and I'd say, "Oh, that sounds good." And he said, "Yeah, no, I'm not sure about that." Well, we'll keep it. And we basically, he had the final say, obviously, that he would get just a little sort of touch, and he put it in the track. You think, oh, that's just perfect. And he had that ability, and he treated his own vocals the same. I mean, he'd probably hate me for saying this, but he used to do 2 or 3 takes of his lead vocal, and he would get down to the point where he would say he sang a 3-syllable word. He'd say, I want the first syllable from that take, the second syllable from that take, and the third syllable from that take. And so me and Rhett would have to mute and unmute these channels to between mid, but he was always right. He was always right. It's like when you heard the finished thing, spot on, absolutely perfect. And so the whole creative process to me was learning how to write. I discovered during my time at Gallery, those 3 years I worked at Gallery, I worked with Roxy Music and saw how Brian Ferry went around writing songs. I also spent 6 months working for a guy called Alan Tarney, who you won't have heard of, but you may have heard of Cliff Richard, right?
Who's he?
Right, and you may have heard of a song called "We Don't Talk Anymore."
Yeah, which is a
It's
massive
so funny.
hit. Yeah,
We don't talk anymore. Well, that was written and produced by Alan Tarney, right? And he wrote January, February for Barbara Dictionary, January, February, June. Leo Sayer, he wrote middle of the road hits, and he block booked Gallery for 6 months and was quite happy for me to engineer, although I was really inexperienced. I was good enough to do what he needed for these demos. He'd come in at about 10 o'clock in the morning. He'd wander around strumming a guitar or playing a keyboard, and he could do everything. He could play guitar, bass, keyboards, could sing, could do harmonies, the lot. All he needed me for was to program a drum pattern. We had Lin drums by then, you know, really good programmable drum machine. And by noon, he'd have the basic chord structure. And by 7:30, he'd be driving home with a 24-track demo. And he'd come in 5 days a week, and every day he'd go over with a new song. And at the end of a month, he'd done 20 tracks. And I said to him, I said, Alan, you've just written 20 hits. Because to me, they were all bloody hits. And he said, no, he said, there's 2 there that I might use. He said, I'll tell you what, I remember it was so clear, he was just leaving. He was just closing the door of his Porsche, as they do, these rich writers. And he stopped and he said, I'll tell you what, he said, I'll give you 2 weeks to figure out the 2 that you think I'll use. Slammed the door and drove off. So I had a cassette that I'd been making with all 20 songs on. And it took me 2 weeks and I got the 2. And I said, it's that one and that one. He said, yeah. And he taught me so much about the craft of songwriting. He treated it like a discipline. He said, if you've got a framework, whether it be verse, chorus, middle eight, whatever, or it be the layers of sound. So you've got the bass, then you'd have chugging guitars, and then he'd have power chords, and then maybe he'd have a soft pad sound on a synth, and then and what he would do, he'd always want the lyrics for the chorus, and he would sing them and put a harmony on it. But for the verses, he'd just go la da 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 da. He'd have the melody, but he wasn't worried about the lyrics. He said the lyrics tell a story, but it's the chorus that's the hook. And that's all. I need to know that the chord progression will hold a hook. That was his expression, was hold a hook. So if the chord progression's right, it'll hold a hook. You'll be able to come up with a top line melody that will give you the right scat to come up with the phrasing to write a hook. Oh my God. I mean, it just blows my mind talking to you about it. I learned so much about songwriting from Alan. And I worked with OMD, which I forgot to mention in my book, but they were being produced by Rhett Davis. But by that time in his career, Rhett was more interested in playing golf. And so he used to go home at 6 o'clock, and the 2 OMD boys would sort of say, well, I said, well, I'll carry on, I don't mind. So, all right. They would say, Rhett would come in the next morning, it'd be a totally different track. They say, hey, what do you think? It's good, isn't it? I say, yeah, okay. Sort of go with that. But that, again, they had their way of writing. So I soon discovered through that 3 years that there are as many ways of writing songs as there are songwriters, but that there are certain principles that apply across the board. I mean, one of the things, there's so many things I could say, but one of the things Alan said to me, he said, when you add a part to a track, it should lift the track by a quantifiable amount. If it doesn't, it's filler. And people tend to pile filler on to make up from deficiencies in the chord structure. He said, if you end up not being able to come up with ideas for parts, it's probably because the chord progression isn't good enough. So you need to go back to that and look at that rather than keep piling on parts on parts on parts. I mean, that's just priceless information.
Ian, we've already spoken about, your time working with Roxy Music on Avalon as a production assistant, and obviously your tenacity to want to work in as a studio producer.
Yeah.
Come on next to the next chapter, which I think is fair to say is kind of a life-changing moment in your career. And that was eventually going on to work with Duran Duran, who became one of the super bands of the 80s. But my first question was, can you tell us how you met the band and how did you become involved in working with them?
Yeah, that's it's a lovely story. One of the bands that Duran looked up to were Roxy Music, and as we discussed earlier, I worked at Roxy Music's or Phil Manzanera's studio where Roxy recorded. Purely by coincidence, Roxy and Duran were both touring in Germany at the same time. Phil Manzanera, guitarist in Roxy Music, went out for a night just to relax, went to a club and met a couple of the members of Duran Duran who were doing the same thing. I think it was Nick Rose and John Taylor, but I could be wrong. And they started to talk to Phil, him being that much older and them respecting him. And they said that Colin Thurston had very much produced the first two albums, because obviously with the first album they didn't have a clue, they'd never worked in studios before. The second one they were still on a learning curve, but they said, you know, he did a great job, but by the time they got to doing their third album, they felt they wanted to be more involved in producing themselves, and so they wanted to co-produce with somebody that was new. And Phil, bless his heart, said, well, you should check out this young kid at my studio because he's really got his finger on the pulse. Phil came back off to, you know, a couple of months later and said, oh, by the way, you're going to hear from Duran Duran. They were already huge because Rio had been out. And I thought I just said, yeah, of course they are. You know, they're going to ring up little old me who's done absolutely nothing. And I said, it's a wind-up. He said, no, well, you wait and see. 2 days later, one of their managers, one of the two Barrow brothers, I can't remember which, rang me up and said, we would like you to remix one of Duran Duran's tracks. Are you happy to do that? And I said, yeah, absolutely. And they said, okay, we booked some time at Good Earth Studios, which was owned by Tony Visconti, a famous producer in Soho. So if you go there, the table will be there, everything will be ready for you. So I turned up at the studio, ready, sat down, the assistant engineer was there, the master tape, the 2-inch tape we used to use in those days, all loaded up. And I sat down and I waited and I waited and I waited. And after about 45 minutes, I said to the assistant, I said, when are the band turning up? And he said, no, I don't think they're coming. I said, what do you mean they're not coming? I had never, I mean, first of all, I'd only been in the industry for 3 years anyway, but I'd never, ever done a mix for a band where they weren't there to say, yeah, I like that, don't like that. So I thought, well, this is just unfair. You know, how can they expect me to do a mix they like if they're not here to give me feedback? So I was furious, and it was in the basement of the studio. I went marching upstairs, went out onto the streets, smoked about 10 cigarettes, and then thought, fuck it, I'm going to go down there, I'm just going to do it. And I could take 2 or 3 days doing a mix. I did it in 6 hours. And basically, I just made it as aggressive as possible. I made it so the snare could cut your ears off. I pushed Andy's guitars up, put some distortion on it. John's bass was in stereo, and I put it into I just made it sound really tough and as punky as I could. And thought, well, I'll never hear from them before because it's so different to their material. And I just sort of said to the assistant, I'll send it wherever it's got to go to. And I drove home and cried my eyes out. And sort of Phil was there and he listened to it. He said, oh, it's not so bad. I said, Phil, it's rubbish. They're never going to employ me after that. Over the following week, every one of the band rang me up and said, to the effect, we've never heard our stuff sound so exciting. So we would like you to produce a single for us. And that was the beginning of it. And just to round out that story, the first thing they asked me to do was to produce a single, standalone single. And the reason for that was because of the amount of touring and media commitments that EMI had committed them to. There was going to be a year gap between the release of Rio and what would become the third album, Seven and the Ragged Tiger. And so they wanted a single to come out in the spring of '83 to bridge the gap, because the album wouldn't be out till Christmas of that year. And so that was the first thing they asked me to do, was to produce a single.
You've spoken about kind of the very foundations, the very beginnings of creating this remix, which you felt wouldn't be necessarily received well by the band and particularly by the management company. That results in you producing a single and then going on to produce the well-known and famous album Seven and the Rag Tiger. I wanted to first of all talk about the creative process on producing the single, and then kind of tell us the story about producing the actual album, how that kind of evolved, and how was that experience kind of working creatively with the band at that point?
It was, well, it was a huge, first it was a huge culture shock. I quite liked their first album. I thought tracks like Girls on Film, Hungry Like the Wolf, what was the third one? Planet Earth. They all had a kind of remnants of the punk sound. They were quite edgy, they were quite tough sounding, whereas Rio really went for the commercial jugular. You know, it was much more musical. They had these really lavish videos, and they lost me at that point a little bit. I didn't really like it. To me, it was too soft. But we went into the studio, and they were fantastic people. Straight away, we all got on. We were, friends straight away. It was, our commonality with Roxy music, and we all got on. The first thing I said, well, can we hear the demos for the track you want to record? And they said, we haven't got any. I said, what? What do you mean you haven't got any? Well, we haven't written any songs. We've got to write it now. I said, well, what do you mean you've got to write it now? Well, we'll just write it now. Andy's got this idea for a guitar riff. We'll listen to, we'll start with, this was unbelievable to me. This was like a major label signing. This was going to be like a standalone single, and they hadn't got any songs ready. And it was, again, because of the amount of media work they were doing and touring and everything else. So we just started from scratch there and then. Again, we were in Good Earth, Tony Visconti's studio. And that was the first shock, the fact they hadn't got any. I mean, most bands are just writing all the time. And I suspect that's where the first two albums came from, was songs that they'd been writing while they were being formed and getting signed and all the rest of it. But by the time it came to doing that single, they'd run out. So that was a shock. There'd also been some rumours floating around that they were just a puppet band, and that they didn't play their own instruments, and that they were just the front people because they were all good looking, and they were the front. And there was a load of session players that were actually making the music. Well, they soon put that to bed because they could all play, and play more than competently. And the way the thing started was Andy had that guitar phrase, if you know the song, you have to forgive my musical impersonation of electric guitar, but that's basically an out of tune rendering of the riff that runs through. It's kind of Beatlesque, and that was what the track was built around. So John then came up with a bass line that sat underneath it. Roger came up with a rhythm that enhanced the plucking rhythm that Andy was using, and it just gradually evolved, and we all took very few times. I mean, one of the roles of a producer is that you have to arbitrate if there's a conflict and it becomes a deadlock. But there were maybe 2 or 3 occasions when I had to say, okay, we're doing this because nobody else could make their mind up. But most of the time, there wasn't any egotistical tantrums at that stage. They were still fresh enough to being successful. I sort of, was almost that thing, we couldn't believe our luck type of feeling, that let's just carry on being friends and working together, and move the thing forward. And it turned out to be a successful song. It all came together quite well. Stuck an intro on the front, which is, it goes boom, boom, boom. It's taken from Be My Baby by the Ronettes, an old Motown record.
Is that a Phil Spector production?
No, I think it's just, it might be. I think it's a bit before him, but don't quote me. But I think it's Be My Baby by the Ronettes. It goes boom, 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 ka, boom, 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 ka. I saw him. Well, we'd finished the track, and it just started with Andy's guitar. And I said, it needs a distinctive intro so that the second time someone hears it, they'll know it's your new single. So it doesn't sound generic, because it did a bit to my ears. And I said, what about doing that? And I explained the idea of the intro, the Ronettes track, and Roger played it, and Simon sang, please, please tell me now. Boom, boom. It all fell together perfectly, and that was the intro of the song. That was it.
I wanted to come on next and ask you how you would describe your relationship with the band, both individually and collectively. And whilst we kind of talk about the production side of working with them, you work with them on many occasions, and we've discussed some of the projects, the single, of course, Seven and the Rag Tiger. You also produced the Live at the Hammersmith Odeon and some B-sides as well. Do you have a favorite project you work with them on, and why?
Excuse me. It would be that first single, because first of all, I produced it on my own, or co-produced it with them. And as everyone knows, we had trouble mixing it, which was down to my lack of experience. And Alex Sadkin was brought in the end to mix it. I mean, we tried various different people and various different studios, but just couldn't get it mixed. And somebody mentioned Alex Sadkin, and he got it mixed, and it sounded brilliant. And then EMI decided that they wanted him to produce the album and not me. That's another story that we'll go into maybe later. But I've lost my train of thought now. That's terrible, isn't it? What was I saying?
I think that might be an interesting moment to kind of pick up on, because you said that there was a moment where you wouldn't produce Seven and the Rag Tiger. Can you kind of give us some background and the story behind that?
Yeah. What happened was, as I say, I'd allowed the assistant engineer at Good Earth to record the drums. And it's actually a very difficult thing to record drums, live drums properly. And the level was not consistent throughout the track because the kid hadn't used compression properly or a limiter. You know, there's ways that you can make so regardless of how hard the drummer hits the drums, it will always have a certain level that's recorded, so it stays consistent from beginning to end. And I hadn't overseen that. And so there were these dips and rises in the level of the drums, and that's why we couldn't get it mixed, is because you'd set the level at the beginning, and then when you got to the chorus, the drums would be completely swamped out. So you'd raise them, then you go back to the beginning and it's, the drums are too loud, you know. So we tried doing a mix at Good Earth, we tried doing one at Pete Townsend's Eel Pie studio. We went back to Gallery, Phil's studio, tried a mix there. We even flew to New York and did a mix with Bob Clearmountain, who was the man to go to. He mixed Avalon. And he did a fantastic mix. But when we all convened back in London and went to EMI, they said, yeah, it's a nice mix, but it doesn't sound like Duran Duran. It sounds like a guitar band. And they were right. And that was someone, I don't know who it was, I can't remember to this day, but someone suggested Alex Sadkin, who was based in London. He produced and broken the Thompson Twins in America. So he produced their breakout album. So everybody liked that. And so we went to Alex and his engineer, Phil Thornley, they spotted the fault straight away. Well, not straight away, but they identified what the problem was. And using what were pre-sampler digital delays. This is a little bit technical, so bear with us, folks. It's worth knowing because it's an interesting little detail. Sampling hadn't quite arrived, but there were these things called DMSs that were digital delays, and they had 1 or 2 seconds of capacity in terms of the memory of the sound that they, the length of sound that they could store, and then they would repeat it. But there was also the function where you could store a sound like a snare drum and then hit a button to trigger it or have an external trigger it. And so what Alex and Phil Thornley did was to compress Roger's drum playing down to little clicks that were then, they could make the same level all the way through the track and had those trigger their samples of their favorite snare, their favorite kick drum and so on. And then once we got that sorted out, they got that sorted out, and there was a constant level of the drums all the way through the track, it was easy to build the rest of the mix up on top of it. So that was how that transpired. And then what happened was, I guess, it's like what's that thing about the king having no clothes? That was the point at which they realized that I was really inexperienced, that I had only been working in the industry for 3 years. And although I had some great ideas, which they liked and why they liked working with me at that point, I didn't have the technical experience to pull off a project of that scale. And so record company EMI and their managers, the Barrow brothers, decided that they would get Alex to produce the album and not me. And they rang me up and said, look, we're really sorry, appreciate your work, thank you very much, you'll get paid for it, but you're not doing the album. I said, you can't do this. I mean, everybody will know I failed. I mean, that's like getting the sack. You know what I mean? That's the end of my career. And they said, well, we're sorry, but it's too big a project for us to take that risk. I went to the band and they said, well, again, we really like working with you, Ian, but we can't go against our record company. And then I went to see Alex, and the record company hadn't even asked him. They'd just taken it for granted that he would jump at the chance. And he said, what do you mean they're not doing it? He said, no, that's not right. That's stupid. He said, and I've received so much flack for this comment. I didn't say this. Alex said this, okay? Unfortunately, he's not with us anymore. He died, but he said to me, from what I've seen, you're like a 6th member of the band. Now, I would never claim that for myself, but what he meant was, and he went on to explain, was you understand the chemistry between them. And to throw that out is like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You may lack experience, but your relationship you've got with them, and it combined with the ideas you have, I won't do it without you. And that was basically it. He got me reinstated as co-producer.
And the rest, they say, is very
Is
much
history.
history. Yeah. I
Yeah.
wanted to kind of move away from your work with Duran Duran and talk about some of the other bands you've worked with, which include New Asia, Belouis Some, and Sparks, and of course OMD as well.
Yeah.
What are your memories of working with some of those bands? And are there any projects working with those groups that you're particularly proud of?
Well, yeah, where to start? There's such a weird collection of things. I mean, let's start off with the one that I had the least impact but the most fun, if you like, was OMD, because they were being produced by Rhett Davis, who was Roxy Music's producer. So it was being recorded at Gallery Studios. This is before Duran, during the 3 years that I lived and worked there. And what happened, by that time in his career, Rhett was more interested in playing golf than producing music, the truth be told. He'd made his money, and at 6 o'clock every evening he'd be off home, you know, sit in front of the telly, have his dinner, and he was a happy lad. But the two guys in OMD would always sort of say, well, can't we carry on? And I'd say, well, yeah, I'll carry on, you know. And so I would work with them, trying out all sorts of weird and wonderful new ideas. Rhett would come in the next morning and it would sound the track would sound completely different. And he'd say, whoa, what's been about? Well, he stayed here with Ian last night. And of course, the band had the final say in it. And a lot of the stuff we did remains in that album, because it's called Dazzle Ships. It's a polarizing album. Some OMD fans love it, some hate it. I quite like it myself, but that was fun. But that was a quirky little incident. In terms of the other projects you mentioned, I guess the most substantial would be the Sparks album, because that involved me going out to Los Angeles and working at Giorgio Moroder's studio, because he had them signed up on a production deal. And you know who Giorgio Moroder is, I guess, or not? Yeah, the godfather of disco. He did Donna Summer's I Feel Love. I'm sure everybody knows that track. He's in his 80s now. He endorsed my book very kindly, Baptism of Fire. He put an endorsement on it saying it's something, a great insight into being in the studio or something like that. So I had the opportunity to meet Giorgio, for one thing. Plus, Sparks were a band that I kind of had a bit of a liking for. They were sort of like a dirty secret somehow, liking Sparks. And they were a couple of real eccentrics, because they were brothers and they looked so different. One of them had a sort of little Hitler-type moustache and used to grease his hair, and the other one used to have bouffant curly hair and was the pretty one.
Yes.
And so the one with the sort of moustache would just stand there on stage like this, like a robot, and the other one would do all the sort of bopping around. And so they were a great couple. But the way that that album started was they sent me a cassette, because that's what you had in those days, with about 20 demos on it. And they said, go through the cassette, choose the songs you like, and then when you arrive, we'll get together and we'll go through what each of us like and don't like. And you couldn't have made it up. The 10 or 12 tracks I liked, they hated, and the 10 or 12 they liked, I hated. So anyway, compromises were made, and we end up settling on a dozen tracks. Like, I can't remember how many were actually put on the final album. And it was a lot of fun. And there's a little aside, a nice little story, possibly to end on, in terms of the work I did with different bands. Giorgio had a collection of classic Ferraris. and he had employed a certified Ferrari mechanic to keep them all in fettle, you know, so they were all tip top, in tune, and ran like a dream. And his name was Tom Walkinshaw or something like that. And after I'd come back to London several months later, the movie Top Gun came out, and the theme tune for Top Gun was Take My Breath Away.
But yeah, but of course by Berlin, and kind of,
and it
almost
was written by Giorgio Moroder, right? And when I looked in Billboard, there it was sitting at the top of the charts. And I looked at the credits and it said Giorgio Moroder stroke Tom Walkinshaw, or whatever his name was. I thought, oh my God, that's the Ferrari mechanic. And I wrote to him, there's no email in those, and said, what on earth happened? And he said, well, I was listening, I was out working on the car, one of the cars in the yard, and I heard Giorgio kept playing that riff over and over, and he came up with some ideas for words. And he said the whole thing just came out in one go, more or less. You know, take my breath away. And he went into Giorgio and said, oh, I've just written a few words. They're probably rubbish, but, you know, if you want to try them. And he just gave them there, left them there. And he said Giorgio never told him that he was going to use them until it came to the time when it was recorded. And even then, he didn't know he was going to get given credit and royalty. I mean, it's like a pension. That's a real feel-good story to end that little episode with Sparks on. So, yeah.
Interestingly, you mentioned Top Gun, obviously came out in 1986, and now we've got the release of the long-anticipated sequel, which seems to be breaking some box office records, with Top Gun Maverick. So
yeah.
Ian, so far in the interview, we've spoken very much about all the highs and successes in your life, as well as the deadlines and the pressures of working with high-profile musicians, record companies, and getting the product out on time. I kind of wanted to skip a little bit forward in the timeline and go on to just discuss some of the hardships in your life, where you battled drug addiction and homelessness when living in New York, and also contracting a vicious form of hepatitis. What are your recollections of those troubled times, and how did you manage to pick yourself up and tackle these obstacles in your life?
Well, to start at the end, simple bloody-mindedness is, and also I'm since my mid-teens, I've been into spirituality. So I'd read, you know, it goes alongside the psychedelia. You know, I'd read all the major religious texts, the Buddhist one, the Bhagavad Gita from Hinduism, and all the rest of it, and was into meditation. And actually being homeless in New York was probably the most liberating time in my life, because when you've got nothing to lose, and you're still alive, and you think, oh, hang on, this isn't so bad. You know, there's a point at which you realize that material things will never make you happy. You'll always want a bigger, a newer, a more of something. Whereas in fact, inside you is all you ever need. We are complete, whole, perfect beings. You know, you just need to be present in the moment and not caught up in your thoughts. I mean, we're discussing my past, and so I'm talking about the past and reliving all that. But at the same time, every now and then I just take one conscious breath where I consciously breathe in and breathe out again. And that then re-grounds me in the moment, being here now, because the moment now is timeless. Thoughts exist in time, and they take you away from the moment. They either take you into the past, either happy memories or regretful memories, or they projections into the future, either things you're frightened of or things you're looking forward to. Either way, they're not real, they're thoughts, and thoughts have no substance. They're created in your brain. They don't, like if I think of a knife, I can't cut myself with it, right? So, you know, but being it, so that's what got me through all of it. But the start was in Sydney when the pressure really started to kick in. I had loads of money. I went to a private doctor and got him to prescribe some really fucking heavy, excuse my language, really heavy painkillers. And I got addicted to them, and had a real falling out with Alex, which thankfully we made up. I would hate to have him died without having, you know, made up with him. But he basically said, you don't realize what your responsibility is. You're not taking your part of the responsibility. You've got to buck up. You know, he really tore into me justifiably. But that then led to me becoming a heroin addict. So by the end of 83, I'd got a 6-figure amount in my bank, or you know, and by 86, the end of December 86, I was made bankrupt because I couldn't pay a £20,000 VAT bill. So I went from having money that you wouldn't even dream of, that, you know, more money than my dad earned in his lifetime, or my whatever, and to having nothing.
Interestingly, I wanted to ask you, having that money and coming from very sort of modest roots,
yeah,
would you say you feel more contented in life maybe now in the present time to actually when you were at the height of success and being able to just buy materialistic things and just consume things easily and have accessibility to things that most people wouldn't have? Would you?
Well, I mean, what it basically boils down to is I know the punchline. I know that money doesn't make you happy. So I learned through experience. I can tell someone, looking them straight in the eye, if you won £1 million today, within 3 to 6 months, the novelty will have worn off and you'll be left with your problems that you've got now. And that's the truth. Within very short amount of time, being able to buy whatever you want loses its novelty. I mean, if you look at the history of lottery winners, it's something like a 75% failure rate. Like the people that have won the lottery, they get divorced, they get family problems,
or they blow the money eventually,
get bankrupted. Just look, yeah, it happens. 75 to 80% of the lottery winners fuck up because they're not used to it. They haven't been brought up to have that sort of money, and they suddenly think, this is all my problems solved. Your problems are in your head. They're not out there. They're not in the world. They're in your head. And that's what my life now is all about, is being in the moment as much as possible and not thinking about the future. You know, and there's nothing wrong with having ambition. And there's nothing wrong with trying to better yourself. But as long as you start off from the point of view that it doesn't really matter what happens, that you start off from a position of already being perfectly fine and perfectly content. So I can set out to write my book and make it as best book I possibly can, but doesn't really matter whether it's a success or not. I know that's a bit hard to understand and comprehend at first, but if you sit and think about it, I'll just say this. Have you heard of Eckhart Tolle?
No, I don't.
Okay, write down somewhere, or you've got it on tape. He wrote a book called The Power of Now. He's a little weird German bloke, and he is a spiritual teacher for the 21st century. And I recommend it should be sort of school reading. It's called The Power of Now. And he explains in very straightforward, it's not religion, nothing to do with religion. Religion is dogma. Dogma has done more damage than anything else. I mean, the human race is insane. In the 20th century, human beings killed about 190 million other human beings. How much more proof do you need that people are insane? You can watch people. If you go down a high street, you can watch people. They're walking along in their heads. They're not aware of the wind on their face. They're not aware of the trees, the grass, the other people, anything. They're in their fucking heads. And they're thinking about things that are not real. They're thoughts. And so, yes, I got addicted to heroin. And then what happened was, again, this is luck coming into my life. The year I got made bankrupt, they changed the law to reduce the term from 5 years to 3 years. So I was discharged as a bankrupt in December 1989. And what else happened in December 1989? Decade came out, right? Duran's first greatest hits album. So what that meant was that instead of going to the official receiver, the royalties came to me, right? So I thought, okay, I can either carry on being a junkie and I'll get through that money in about a week, or I can get myself cleaned up. And so I went into residential rehab and started a correspondence with an American girl that I'd met in London, basically writing. And I used to play games because you just want to leave. You just want to leave and go and buy drugs. And I used to say, I go to bed at night and say, if I don't get a letter from this girl, I'm not going to name her, in the morning, I'll leave. Every time there'd be a letter there. And so I stayed the course, got myself clean, and I had about 2 weeks in London and then went to New York. And then what happened in New York was I had 3.5, 4 really great years. And then I relapsed. The relationship broke down. I had an American business partner because I didn't have a green card. And I started using heroin again. And in America, oh my God, they don't mess about. I was staying in an apartment that was costing £2,500 a month, dollars a month. That's in like 80, well, 90 something. It's a lot of money. You don't pay your rent for 3 months, you're out. There's no sort of appeal or tenants' rights or anything. Boom, that's it. And so, and I didn't know that many people in New York, really. So I sofa surfed for about a month. And then I can remember the day when I suddenly realized there's nobody I can ring that will put me up because they've all had enough of it. And that's when I first spent a night on the streets. So I knew where all the homeless people were. And so I just went up to some bloke and said, what do I do? I've got to sleep on the street tonight. And he said, oh, don't worry, mate. Sorry, it should be a Brooklyn accent. Don't worry, buddy, I'll sort you. Anyway, first thing you got to do is find dry cardboard. Then you get some, other shit together. And yeah, it certainly breeds character.
Ian, I want to ask one final question.
I spent 9 months homeless in New York, right through one winter. That is heavyweight. Because it's every day in the winter.
I want to ask you one final question, and then we lead on to the final questions that we ask all Your Take guests to find out things about you that maybe we didn't establish during the interview, and find out things outside of your love of music and working as a producer. But my kind of final question was a kind of summing up of how do you look back at your life? And obviously you've written a memoir book, Baptism of Fire, which recounts your time working in the record industry, but particularly with Duran Duran. How do you kind of sum up all these experiences, and what is kind of your outlook on the future? Do you want to get back into the recording industry in some capacity, or do you want to do something else new and different in your life? What's kind of your outlook to the future?
I can answer that really simply. I'm still very much into music, but a very different type of music to the sort I've known for. And I've just had last week the best news ever, which about 2-3 years ago, I was reading Metro, which is the free newspaper in London. And I read a review. They had a music review section, and it was live gigs, and it said Clipping, an experimental hip hop trio from LA. That's all I needed to read. I said, I've got to hear, who are these Clipping people? So I found them on Apple Music. I loved it. It's just noise, absolutely noise, with this amazing rapper called David Diggs. Have you seen Snowpiercer?
Oh, I know that. Yeah, I know the
Think
film.
about the train.
Yeah.
Well, the guy with dreadlocks, he's the rapper in Clipping. That's David Diggs. And I wrote them an email as a fanboy saying, if I was going to make a record now, I'd want it to sound exactly like yours do. And they replied. They said, oh, well, we really like the stuff you did in the you know, the album they pointed at, Sparks, the Sparks album. They said, we really loved that Sparks album you did.
And interestingly, they've kind of made a little bit of a resurgence
with
the recent documentary feature film that was released last year.
Yeah. So anyway, they wrote back, and I said, oh, you know, I just can't thank you enough for getting back to me. And they said, no, man, it's cool. And they said, we've got a new album coming out. And I said, oh, that's great. I said, any chance of an early listen? And they said, well, you know, 3 or 4 years ago, we gave copies to a few of our friends, and one of them leaked it. And so we're not prepared to do it. But if our label will, then yeah, and we'll suggest that they do. Guess who their label is? Sub Pop. Do you know who Sub Pop are? They're the label that signed Nirvana.
Oh, right, yeah, okay.
Nirvana.
Yeah, okay.
They released their first single. So this is like the coolest label in the world. They've got the coolest band in the world. I got an email from the president, a guy called Tony Kuhl, who said, yeah, you know, I've read your email. There's a copy of the album. So I listened to this album, and it was the second of 2 albums which they call the horror albums. One was called A Vision of Bodies Being Burned, and the other was called There Was an Addiction to Blood, right? And they were just really nasty, noisy. You know, I love it. So I kind of did a critique of the album, and I said, I love every track except for the 3rd track, where they used a guest rapper in the beginning, and I thought he had a weird accent. He said the word coffin, and he went coffin, like, I thought, what the? So I said to them, I like all the, you know, but I'm not sure it was called He Dead. And so they wrote back and said, well, do you want to remix it? And I said, what? Yeah, go on then. So they sent the stems over. And I've got a friend who's got a studio down here. You know, this is just a muck about what I've got here, but he's got a proper studio. So I said, John, we've got clipping stems on the computer. Can you believe it? To me, it was like having the Beatles master tape in my hand or something. To have clipping stems on the computer. But all we used was the vocals. We completely rebuilt the track. We took 9 months over it and thought, well, we've blown it. because the album's dead and buried. So we sent it anyway, and I didn't hear back. And I thought, well, I really was convinced. A year had gone by since they'd first said, "Do you want to remix it?" And then I thought, why don't I just drop Tony an email and see what if they thought what they thought of the mix, and I sent him an email. He said, "Oh, how strange," he said, "just the other day I found your mix. We couldn't figure out what it was. And I played it to one of the clipping guys. And they said, oh, that's that guy from England. That's his remix. Let's have a listen." And they loved it. And so what they said was, we're going to do a remix album called the Horror Remixes. So they gave 7 or 8 different people, I'm not sure how many, tracks off of both of the albums, a selection of the 2 albums, and it's going to be the Horror Remixes. And the track that I did is going to be the lead out single. And I got the request for the metadata last week. So that means it's a reality. When a label asks you for metadata, that means it's being released. It's the information that goes on the downloads. It enables people to find it, and you give them your publishing details, so I'll get paid. Not didn't do it for the money, but oh my God, I'm so chuffed that I'm going to have it. And they actually have given me. It says artist clipping Ian Little, and that I think is probably one of the proudest credits I've ever had. I mean, more even maybe than Roxy, because Avalon is a classic album and I love it to bits. I like really nasty music, to be honest. Weirder the better.
Ian Little, we come to that moment, but it's interesting. We've almost become full circle, and it's really interesting to see, what you've just told us in terms of the remixes and producing again and doing your first love. And it's lovely to see kind of your reaction to that as well. But this is the final set of questions that we ask every single Your Take guest. All 60 plus so far have answered these same questions. Don't think about them in any detail at all. What comes straight into your head, things you like, things you don't like. Number 1, Ian Little, what would you say is your favorite pastime?
Listening to Urquhart Tolle. He has, there's loads of free YouTube clips of him talking. And I just go to bed every night with that playing in my ear. That's how I stay in the moment and really expand my awareness of my true self, my inner self.
We've spoken so much about everything's been on pretty much a musical theme, but before we started recording the interview, we spoke about technological change. We mentioned a little bit about the film industry. We talk about your favorite film. What is it and why? Right.
Well, it's either Dr. Strangelove, How I Learned to Love the Bomb. Do you know it?
You're talking about one of my idols. I'm a massive Stanley Kubrick fan.
There you go.
I think the man was an incredible visionary and just a true artist.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the scenes that I still think is maybe one of the best sequences ever put in a movie is the bit where they realize that the guy has gone AWOL at the base, and so American troops are attacking the base to try and get the codes off him, and it's filmed like in a reportage style.
Yeah, I know that scene. The
cameraman is sort of running and ducking and sort of like really looks amazing, but Peter Sellers' 3 parts in that are just beyond belief.
George C. Scott's great in it as well. Tremendous actor.
the pratfall that he kept. You remember he does a pratfall. You know what a pratfall is, where you deliberately trip yourself up? George C. Scott does one in the War Room, and he did it as a joke, and Kubrick kept it in. So next time you watch the film, look out for that.
And what was the other film you were going to mention?
The other film is a bit obscure because I did film as my secondary subject at art school. It's a film called Closely Observed Trains, and it was made somewhere in the Eastern European.
It's a Czech film, yeah.
Is it Czech? Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, you're a good man. Fuck me. Not many people know that. And the thing I like about it is, you remember the way the kid, you've got the older guy who's the station master, and then his young acolyte that's learning the ropes off him, and he starts an affair with the woman guard on this train that comes through every day, and they have a fuck on this leather chaise lounge in the manager's office. And there's this one scene where she sticks her stiletto heel through the leather and rips it, and it's like the whole film is about real detail of human interactions on a very personal level, and then at the end they blow up the train, and you just feel like, or I did, what an ordinary person would feel like going and doing that, because the rest of the film had been about so much about the small world of this station master's office and the goings on between. I think there's only three characters: the girl, the bloke, the boy, and the old guy. And then they go and blow up a train at the end of it. It's just such a shock to the system. Anyway, so they're two.
From the genius of Stanley Kubrick and a Czech film, a very much an acclaimed Czechoslovakian film. We move on to books now. Who would you say is your favourite novelist?
I'm not a great novel reader, so I don't have one.
Choose yourself. You've written a book.
Yeah, me.
Why not?
But that's not a novel either. It's truth.
No, true.
Probably whoever it was that wrote Alice in Wonderland. Oh, I know. No, I'll tell you who's my favourite. Flann O'Brien. Do you know Flann O'Brien? A book called The Third Policeman. He was an Irish writer that also wrote for the Irish Sunday Times under another name, but oh God, what was his other name? But Flann O'Brien, The Third Policeman, definitely. Sure. It was described as being Alice in Wonderland for adults, and it really is. It's like a fictitious land in somewhere in Southern Ireland, and it's all about bicycles and people and the way they interact. When people ride bicycles, they ride along, and this was in the days of solid rubber tires, and so the bicycle would vibrate and the rider would vibrate, and molecules between the bike and the person would exchange. And so you could always tell when a person had become too much bicycle would be when they stopped to talk to you, they'd stand with one foot in the gutter and one on the curb. And you'd know when a bicycle had become too much human when you'd find breadcrumbs down by the front wheel in the morning.
Ian Little, if you could have chosen a different profession, what would it have been?
Film director.
I thought you might say that. Next one, who in life, and I think I know what the answer is going to be, has been your greatest inspiration?
My mum.
I thought you were going to say that from obviously our early conversations earlier in the interview. We move on to newspapers. Do you read a newspaper? And if so, which one?
I don't regularly, but I'm afraid to say, I'm almost embarrassed to say that if I do, it's The Guardian.
Do you know what? Most of the guests we've had on, most of which have worked in creative professions, most of which have chosen the Guardian newspaper, by the exception of maybe one or two.
Yeah.
From the press now to food, what would you say is your favorite food?
Do you know what? It's very simple. A really well cooked beef burger with good fries. Simple. I mean, I love all sorts of food, but if I had to narrow it down, I'd just go for an American burger, you know, a hard rock sort of thing, you know, proper.
Royale with cheese, as they say.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well done. That would have been my other film choice. It's close.
And most people struggle with this one. Nothing comes to their mind quickly, but I don't think you're going to have any issues because you've talked about being a spiritual person. Who would you say is your favorite cultural icon?
Well, Eckhart Tolle, because of his his book, The Power of Now, influenced Oprah Winfrey to do a 10-hour special on him in 1-hour segments where people, he'd be on the stage with her and members of the public could ring in and ask him questions. And he was, I mean, unbelievable. 35 million people watched it. And he is of the opinion that things are getting better and worse at the same time. But the worst things are noticed more because they make so much noise. But that there is a sense of urgency about human consciousness rising, people becoming more conscious, more aware, more present, more in the moment. And so, although that might not be an obvious cultural, I think he will be seen as such. If we survive the next 50 years, people will look back and see him as being one of the most important people of the 21st century.
From cultural icons next to favorite curse words, what is your favorite curse word and why?
Fuck, because it's just so straightforward. It's just, it says what it does on the tin, sort of thing.
Most people choose that one, to be honest.
Yeah, not very.
You've been to many places in the world, particularly in your working capacity. But what would you say is your favorite place or holiday destination?
I think India, Goa. I went to Goa in 2014 after having not been in India since 1975 or something. And I was there for 3 months, didn't want to come home, and I'm very tempted to go back and just live there on the beach with nothing. So I love the heat. I love the it's really hot. The only problem with Goa is that you have to put up with the monsoon if you live there. But I think it would probably be India. I mean, the West Indies are a safer option, but you've got to have more money to live there. You can live in India for nothing.
I never like to ask a musical person this question with so many influences. But who, if you had to choose one, who is your favorite music artist? And what would you say is your favorite all-time album? I can never choose.
I suppose really my favorite musical artist is Eno, and once he left Roxy. And probably my favorite album, therefore, is Here Come the Warm Jets, his first album. But you know, any of his first 3 albums, Here Come the Warm Jets, Taking Tiger Mountain by Strategy, or Another Green World. They're his first 3 solo albums.
Next, what would you say is your greatest achievement to date?
Still being alive at 68.
And the final one, Ian, how do you wish to be remembered?
Laughing. That's how
As
I
you
want
are
to be.
now.
Yeah, as I am now. I'm so happy. I am
Yeah,
so happy.
It's
I-
been an incredible kind of journey, your life, and I
yeah.
thank you kindly for sharing just part of it. I kind of almost think we could have done this in so many parts, and this could have literally gone on for hours,
Yeah.
because you're someone who's so passionate about music and what you've done, what you've achieved, what you've learned, who you've learned from. There's been so many kind of elements to
And
the
I haven't
discussion.
even
Fascinating.
I haven't even talked about my favorite artists. I mean, my favorite artist is Jean-Michel Basquiat. You know, and I when I lived in New York, it was like his presence was still there. He just died, but you know, I could talk for an hour on fine art because I'm so passionate about that. The surrealist, the Dadaist, all the different movements. I'm only into 20th century art really, and particularly the first half of the 20th. But yeah, you're right. It's been a real pleasure, mate. Really
No,
have.
thank you kindly, and I really thank you for taking time out of your evening to talk and share about all the highs and lows, and almost give us some sort of moralistic lesson as well, to kind of learn from your experiences and what's happened throughout the different kind of chapters, I guess, in your
Yeah,
life.
yeah,
I was
yeah.
good. I was going to ask you, where do we kind of purchase the book? Where do we find out more about what you're doing? And yeah,
The
just
easiest thing is to go to my website, which is simple enough. It's just www.ian-little.com.
I'm very interested to see what happens in your future, particularly getting back behind kind of the mixing desk and
Yeah,
producing kind of for a new age, and with all this
yeah.
new technological change. And to finally wrap up, I wish you all the best and continued success, and keep smiling as well. Thank you
Well,
kindly.
no problem. It's been a pleasure, Nick. It really has.
It's James, but I'll forgive you for
Sorry,
that one.
sorry, Nick.
Lovely
Sorry.
way to end on.